Dad, you're first. My son locked both restaurant doors, turned toward me, and said those three words while my entire family watched. 5 minutes earlier, we had been raising our glasses to my granddaughter Emily's graduation. Now Richard claimed $500 had disappeared from his wallet, and nobody was leaving until he found the thief. But what frightened me wasn't the accusation. It was the way he looked directly at me before searching anyone else, as though he already knew exactly where the missing money would be found. Before I tell you what happened next, please subscribe and let us know in the comments where you're listening from today. My name is Thomas Bennett. I was 71 that night, and after losing my wife several years earlier, family gatherings had become more important to me than ever. Emily's graduation dinner should have been one of the happiest. She sat at the center of the table surrounded by people who had watched her grow up, smiling whenever someone raised another toast in her honor. For a while, everything felt peaceful. Then Richard suddenly stood and slapped one hand against the table. $500 is gone. Conversation stopped. Sarah frowned and asked what he meant. Richard opened his wallet and said he had arrived with $500 in cash, $500 bills, and now they were missing. David suggested checking his car. Someone else asked whether he might have spent them earlier. Richard rejected every explanation immediately. I know what I had. Someone in this room took it. Emily quietly said, Dad, please, not tonight. He barely acknowledged her. Sarah even offered to replace the money herself if it would end the scene, but Richard shook his head. I don't want replacement money. I want the thief. Then he walked to the double doors and locked them. That sound changed the entire room. Mark stood and ordered him to open them. Richard refused. Nobody leaves until everyone has been checked. His wife whispered that he was embarrassing their daughter. He ignored her and told everyone to put their purses, jackets, and belongings on the table. I finally pushed my chair back. Enough, Richard. This is Emily's graduation, not an interrogation. His eyes moved toward me, and the anger on his face disappeared. In its place came a strange calm. He walked past Sarah, past David, past Mark. He didn't ask any of them to empty their pockets. He stopped beside my chair. Stand up, Dad. I looked around the table. Nobody spoke. Emily had gone pale. Why me? I asked. Richard extended his hand. Because you're first. That was when I knew this had never been a random search. He had chosen me before he locked those doors. I could have refused, but I saw exactly what he wanted. An argument, anger, something he could point to as proof that I had something to hide. I wouldn't give it to him. I stood slowly. Go ahead. A faint smile appeared on his face. He began patting down the outside of my jacket with enough force to make the humiliation obvious. David rose again, but I signaled for him to stay back. Richard checked my trouser pockets, then both outer jacket pockets. Nothing. Sarah told him to stop. Mark called the whole thing disgraceful. Richard ignored them. What caught my attention was that finding nothing didn't make him uncertain. It made him more focused. His eyes moved across my jacket as though he were following steps he had already rehearsed. Then I looked at Emily. She wasn't watching her father anymore. She was staring at my coat, and her hands were trembling beneath the table. Emily? I said softly. Her eyes immediately dropped. Richard grabbed the front of my jacket and pulled it open. Dad, stop, Emily suddenly whispered. He glanced toward her. Sit down. Please, she said. Just let Grandpa go. Richard's expression hardened. Stay out of this. Emily looked close to tears. Something was wrong, something larger than 5 missing bills, and my granddaughter seemed to know what it was. Richard checked one inner pocket. Empty. Then another. Empty. David let out a breath and told him the humiliation had gone far enough. But Richard didn't step away. Instead, his eyes settled on the narrow breast pocket inside my jacket. I almost never used it. My reading glasses normally went there, but that evening they were sitting beside my plate. Richard slowly reached toward the pocket. Emily stood so quickly her chair scraped backward. Dad, don't. Everyone turned toward her. Richard paused for only a second before sliding his fingers inside my coat. I watched his face carefully. First, concentration, then recognition. Finally, satisfaction. His hand stopped. The corner of his mouth lifted into a smile. Whatever Richard had just touched inside my jacket, he wasn't surprised to find it. He looked directly into my eyes and whispered, "Got you." Richard kept his hand inside my jacket for another second, staring at me with the satisfaction of a man who believed the ending had already been written. "Got you," he repeated, louder this time. I didn't look at his hand. I looked at his face. There was no surprise there, and that bothered me more than anything he could possibly pull from my pocket. "What did you find?" I asked. Instead of answering, Richard tightened his grip on whatever was inside and slowly began withdrawing his hand. Sarah stood immediately. "Richard, stop. You've gone far enough." He ignored her. David moved closer and told him to take his hands off me, but I raised one palm. I didn't want anyone giving Richard an excuse to turn humiliation into violence. "Let him finish," I said. Richard smiled. "Gladly." Before revealing what he had found, he shoved his other hand into the pocket again, feeling around as though he needed to make certain nothing else remained. Then he checked the lining of my jacket, my trouser pockets, a second time, and even ran his hands along my waist. Every movement was unnecessarily rough. I was 71 years old, standing in front of my granddaughter while my own son searched me like a criminal. Yet I refused to give him the anger he seemed desperate to provoke. "Happy now?" I asked. "Not yet." That answer confirmed what I had begun to suspect. Richard wasn't searching for truth. He was performing something he had imagined long before tonight. Sarah was crying now. "Look at Emily," she said. "You're doing this at your daughter's graduation." Richard finally glanced toward her. Emily stood beside her overturned chair, pale and trembling. "She'll understand when she sees what kind of people are sitting at this table," he said. I felt something cold settle in my chest. "What kind of people?" Richard turned back to me. "People who think family means they can take whatever they want." His words carried a bitterness far older than the missing money. I studied him carefully. Suddenly I remembered a business proposal he had brought to me years earlier, the investment he had desperately wanted, and the anger that followed when I refused. I had assumed time had buried that disagreement. Looking at him now, I wondered whether it had been growing beneath everything we had called peace. "This isn't about $500, is it?" I asked quietly. His jaw tightened. "Don't change the subject," he had answered without answering. Across the table, Emily whispered, "Dad, please." Richard snapped at her to sit down. She didn't. Instead, she looked directly at me, and what I saw in her expression confused me. Fear was there, certainly, but underneath it was guilt. She knew something. I was sure of it. "Emily," I said. She shook her head almost imperceptibly, as though begging me not to ask the question yet. Richard noticed the exchange and stepped between us. "Leave her out of this. You brought her into it when you turned her graduation into this circus," David said. Richard spun toward him. "Sit down, Uncle David, unless you want me to search you next." David's face hardened, but again I stopped him. The more Richard pushed, the calmer I became. Something about his behavior was too deliberate. He had locked the doors before searching anyone. He had walked directly to me. He had ignored every empty pocket without hesitation, and when his fingers reached that particular inner pocket, he had smiled before removing anything. A frightened thought entered my mind. What if Richard wasn't trying to discover where his money had gone? What if he believed he already knew where it would be? I turned toward Emily again. Her eyes were fixed on Richard's closed fist. "Emily, do you know something about this?" I asked. "Grandpa," her voice cracked. Richard immediately cut her off. "Enough." Then he stepped back from me and finally raised his clenched hand where everyone could see it. Sarah stopped crying. David went completely still. Emily covered her mouth. Richard looked around the table slowly, making sure every person was watching before turning back toward me. Whatever he was about to reveal, he wanted an audience for it. And at that moment, I understood the most frightening part of the night. My son had never locked those doors because he was afraid the thief might escape. He had locked them because he wanted to make certain nobody could leave before watching what he planned to do to me. Richard slowly opened his fist. 5 folded $100 bills rested in his palm. For several seconds, nobody moved. Nobody even seemed to breathe. I stared at the money, then at the inside pocket of my jacket, trying to understand something my mind refused to accept. $500. The exact amount Richard claimed had disappeared from his wallet had just been pulled from my clothing in front of my entire family. "There it is," he said, raising the bills so everyone could see them. $500. Then he looked directly at me. "My own father stole from me." The words hit harder than the search. "I didn't take that money." Richard laughed. "It was in your pocket. I know where you found it. I'm telling you I didn't put it there." "Then explain how it got there." "I couldn't. That was the trap." Everyone had watched Richard search me. Everyone had watched those bills emerge from my jacket. I knew I was innocent, but innocence without an explanation suddenly sounded like nothing more than denial. Richard had the evidence in his hand. Sarah immediately stepped beside me. "There has to be another explanation," David agreed. "Finding money doesn't prove Dad stole it." Richard turned toward them. "Then where did it come from?" Nobody answered. He smiled bitterly. "Exactly. You always protect him." Something about that sentence caught my attention. He wasn't talking like a man who had discovered a theft 10 minutes earlier. He sounded like someone settling an argument that had existed for years. I looked toward Emily. She had gone completely pale. Unlike everyone else, she wasn't staring at me in disbelief. She was staring at the 5 bills as though she already knew exactly what they were. "Emily?" I said softly. Her eyes met mine for half a second, before dropping to the floor. Richard stepped closer and held the money inches from my face. "Say it, Dad. Admit you took it." "I won't confess to something I didn't do." His expression hardened. "Then maybe you can explain it to the police." He pulled out his phone. Sarah immediately moved between us. "You are not having your 71-year-old father arrested at your daughter's graduation dinner. Move." "No." Mark and David both stood. Richard looked around the table as though gathering witnesses. "Every person here saw where I found the money. Nobody can pretend this didn't happen." I remained silent, watching him. That was when I understood why the locked doors mattered. Richard hadn't merely wanted to accuse me. He wanted an audience trapped inside the room while he produced evidence against me. He wanted Sarah to see it, David to see it. Most of all, he wanted Emily to see it. "Why?" I asked. Richard frowned. "Why what? Why would I steal $500 from you?" His eyes narrowed. "Maybe because you think you can take whatever you want from me." There it was again, that old wound, hidden beneath the accusation. Before I could push further, he began dialing. Emily suddenly whispered, "Dad, don't." Richard ignored her. "Richard," Sarah warned, "put the phone down." His thumb moved toward the call button. Emily stood abruptly. "No." The force in her voice stopped everyone. Richard slowly turned toward his daughter. She was trembling so badly that Sarah reached for her arm, but Emily pulled away. "Don't call the police." Richard held up the money. "Why not?" "We found it on him." "I know." "Then sit down." Emily shook her head. For the first time that night, uncertainty appeared on Richard's face. I looked at my granddaughter and suddenly understood that whatever she had been hiding was about to come out. "Emily," I said carefully, "if you know how that money got into my pocket, tell us now." Tears filled her eyes. Richard's voice sharpened. "Stay out of this." But Emily didn't sit down. She looked first at me, then at the bills in her father's hand. "Grandpa didn't steal your money." Richard gave a short laugh. "We just found it in his jacket." "I know," she repeated. "Then how did it get there?" Emily closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, the frightened girl I had been watching all evening seemed to disappear. She looked directly at her father and said, "Because I know who put it there." Richard froze. The phone slowly lowered in his hand. And suddenly, for the first time since he locked those restaurant doors, my son looked afraid of what someone else was about to say. Richard stared at Emily, as if he had misheard her. "What did you say?" Emily's hands were trembling, but she didn't look away. "I know who put the money in Grandpa's pocket." Richard tightened his grip on the 5 bills. "Then tell us." Emily swallowed hard. "I did." The room went completely silent. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. David stared at Emily in disbelief. Even Richard seemed unable to process the answer. "You?" he finally said. Emily nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. I put the money in Grandpa's jacket. I felt as though the floor had shifted beneath me. Only minutes earlier, I had been trying to understand how $500 I had never touched could possibly have appeared in my pocket. Now my own granddaughter was admitting she had placed it there. "Emily," I said carefully, "why?" She turned toward me, and the guilt on her face broke my heart. "I'm sorry, Grandpa. I never wanted you to get hurt." Richard recovered from his shock first. "You're lying to protect him." "No." "Then why would you take money from my wallet and hide it on him?" Emily wiped her face. "Because I knew you were going to do something tonight." Richard's expression changed instantly. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, I do." She explained that throughout dinner, she had noticed him repeatedly checking the compartment in his wallet where he kept the cash. More disturbing was the way he kept watching me across the table. Whenever I turned toward another guest, Richard's attention returned to my jacket. Emily had already been worried because of things she had heard him say before the graduation dinner. When he left briefly for the restroom, fear overcame her judgment. She took the 5 bills from his wallet. Later, while hugging me after one of the graduation toasts, she slipped them into the inner pocket of my jacket. Sarah stared at her. "Why would you do that?" Emily struggled to answer. "I thought if Dad suddenly claimed his money was missing, I'd know what he was trying to do. I thought I could stop him before he blamed Grandpa." I finally understood the terrible flaw in her plan. She had wanted to expose Richard's intention, but by placing the money on me, she had accidentally created the exact evidence he needed. "When he locked the doors," Emily continued, "I realized I'd made everything worse. Then he walked straight toward Grandpa, and I froze." Her voice broke. "I should have told everyone immediately. I was scared." I reached for her hand. "What you did was wrong." She nodded quickly. "I know. But you're telling the truth now. Keep telling it." Richard gave a bitter laugh. "Listen to yourselves. She admits she stole my money and somehow I'm the problem?" David looked at him incredulously. "Your daughter just explained how the money got into Dad's pocket. That accusation is finished." "It was still found on him. Because Emily put it there." Richard ignored him and turned toward his daughter. "Why him? Out of everyone in this room, why were you so certain I would accuse Grandpa?" Emily went still. That question changed everything. Until then, she had been ashamed of what she had done. Now something harder appeared beneath the fear. "Because this was never about $500. Richard's face lost color. "Emily, stop." "No." Her voice was still shaking, but this time she didn't back down. "You've been angry at Grandpa for years." Richard took a step toward her. Emily immediately recoiled. Sarah moved between them without hesitation. That tiny movement silenced the room again. Richard looked at his daughter. "Don't act like you're afraid of me." Emily stared at him through her tears. For several seconds she said nothing. Then came the words none of us were prepared to hear. "I am afraid of you." Richard froze. I felt my anger disappear beneath something much worse. My granddaughter had been frightened enough of her own father to create a reckless trap instead of simply asking the adults around her for help. This was no longer about what had happened inside the restaurant. Something had been happening long before we arrived. Richard tried to speak, but Emily continued. "I've heard what you say about Grandpa when you think nobody is listening. I've watched you get angry every time someone praises him. Tonight you weren't celebrating my graduation. You were watching him." Richard pointed toward me. "He's manipulating you." Emily shook her head. "Grandpa didn't even know what I did. That's the point." She stepped closer to Sarah but kept her eyes on her father. "I knew you wanted to hurt him somehow. I just didn't know how far you were willing to go." Then she took a shaky breath and said the sentence that finally erased the last trace of confidence from Richard's face. "And 2 nights ago, Dad, I heard the phone call you thought nobody else could hear." Richard's face changed the moment Emily mentioned the phone call. "What phone call?" he asked. But the question came too quickly. Emily noticed it too. "The one you made 2 nights ago when you thought I was upstairs?" Richard shook his head. "You misunderstood whatever you heard." "I haven't even told you what I heard yet." That stopped him. For the first time since locking the restaurant doors, Richard had no immediate response. Emily stood beside Sarah, still trembling, but something had changed in her posture. The fear was there, yet she was no longer allowing it to control every word. I remained silent. If my granddaughter had carried this alone for days, She deserved to tell it in her own way. It started before that call, she said. For months, every time Grandpa came up, you changed. Richard rolled his eyes, but Emily continued. She described dinners where he mocked my retirement after I left the room, car rides where he complained that everyone treated me like I could do no wrong, and evenings when a harmless compliment about me would leave him angry for hours. At first, she dismissed it as resentment between a father and son. Then his questions became stranger. He wanted to know whether I would wear the navy jacket to her graduation dinner. He asked where I would sit. He insisted on booking a private room instead of the open dining area Emily originally wanted. Most disturbing of all, he repeatedly asked whether every member of the family would attend. I thought you were planning some kind of surprise, she said. Then I realized you weren't excited. You were waiting. Richard stepped toward her. That's enough. Emily instinctively moved backward. I saw it clearly this time. She wasn't simply uncomfortable. She was afraid. Don't move toward her, I said. Richard turned on me. Stay out of this. She's my granddaughter. She's my daughter. Then start listening to her like one. His jaw tightened. Emily reached for Sarah's hand and finally said what she had apparently been unable to admit even to herself. I started avoiding being alone with you when you were angry. Richard stared at her. I have never touched you. I didn't say you did. Then stop acting like I'm some kind of monster. Tears returned to Emily's eyes. You don't have to hit someone to make them afraid of you. Nobody at the table moved. Laura lowered her head. That small reaction caught my attention, but this wasn't the moment to question her. Emily continued. She described Richard slamming doors when conversations didn't go his way, breaking a kitchen glass during an argument, and then insisting everyone else had provoked him, and using silence for days whenever Laura or Emily challenged him. None of those incidents alone explained tonight, but together they revealed a household that had learned to organize itself around one man's anger. That's why I took the money, Emily said. It was stupid. I know it was. I thought if I could force whatever you were planning to happen differently, maybe Grandpa would see it before you could hurt him. I squeezed her hand. You should have come to me. I know. Her voice cracked. But I was scared you'd confront him, and then he'd know I told you. Richard laughed bitterly. So now everyone is supposed to believe I'm dangerous because my daughter stole from me? Emily looked at him. No. They should believe me because I'm finally telling them why I was desperate enough to do it. Richard's anger rose visibly. You have no idea what your grandfather has done to this family. Then tell us, she replied. That challenge surprised him. Tell everyone what he did that made you hate him this much? Richard said nothing. Emily wiped her tears and took a breath. You won't, because then you'd have to admit tonight wasn't about your money. She looked around the table, then back at her father. 2 nights ago, I came downstairs for water. You were in your office, with the door almost closed. I heard Grandpa's name, so I stopped. Richard's expression tightened. Emily, you said he needed to learn what humiliation felt like. The room went still. And then you said something else. Richard no longer looked angry. He looked exposed. Emily's voice dropped almost to a whisper. You said he needs to be embarrassed in front of everyone. Sarah slowly turned toward Richard. David did the same. I felt the pieces beginning to fit together, but Emily wasn't finished. She looked directly at me and said, Grandpa, there was someone else on that call, and Dad told them exactly what he wanted to happen tonight. Richard's eyes stayed fixed on Emily. Who exactly do you think I was talking to? He asked. Emily shook her head. I don't know. I only heard your side. Richard immediately seized on that. Then you heard half a conversation and invented the rest. I didn't invent your words. The answer came faster than he expected. Emily explained that 2 nights before graduation she had come downstairs shortly after midnight for a glass of water. Richard's office door was nearly closed, but his voice carried into the hallway. She would have walked past if she hadn't heard my name. Richard had been speaking quietly at first, then his tone sharpened. He spent his whole life making me look small, Emily remembered him saying. This time he gets to feel it, Richard interrupted. That proves nothing. Emily continued as though he hadn't spoken. She heard him ask whether everyone would be there, then confirmed that the private dining room had only 2 doors. He mentioned where I would be sitting, and said he needed the evening to happen exactly as planned. Then came the sentence she had already repeated. He needs to be embarrassed in front of everyone. Sarah stared at Richard. You discussed Dad's seat before tonight? Richard shrugged. We were arranging dinner. Then why did it matter what jacket Grandpa was wearing? Emily asked. That question landed differently. Richard's mouth opened, but nothing came out. I remembered something from earlier in the week. Richard had called me himself and casually asked whether I still owned the navy blazer Beverly had given me years ago. At the time, I thought he was making conversation. Now I understood why Emily had found the question disturbing. You asked me about that jacket too, I said. Richard looked toward me. So what? You rarely ask what I'm wearing to dinner. David leaned forward. And tonight you searched that exact jacket before checking anyone else. The room fell silent again. Richard's story was beginning to collapse under details he had assumed nobody would connect, Emily continued. After the phone call ended, she had returned upstairs, but couldn't sleep. The next morning, she watched her father more carefully. He confirmed the restaurant reservation twice. He asked Laura whether Mark and David were definitely attending. He even complained when Emily suggested moving the dinner into the restaurant's main room because she wanted more atmosphere. You said the private room was necessary, Emily recalled. You said you didn't want interruptions. Richard rubbed both hands across his face. Because it was a family celebration. Then why did you lock the doors? I asked. He looked at me but offered no answer. That was the moment the evening finally made sense. The missing cash, the private room, the seating arrangement, his questions about my jacket, the locked doors, and the fact that he had walked directly to me without searching another person first were not isolated decisions. They formed a sequence. Richard might not have known Emily would move the money, but he had clearly arrived expecting an opportunity to accuse me of something. Her reckless decision had changed the mechanics of his plan, not the intention behind it. What were you planning to do if the money hadn't been in my pocket? I asked. Richard's face tightened. Nothing. I don't believe you. That's your problem. No, Sarah said quietly. It became all of our problem when you locked us in here. Laura finally spoke. Her voice was barely audible. Richard, just tell them. He turned toward his wife so sharply that she flinched. I saw Emily move closer to her mother. Richard noticed it too. For a moment, something like shame crossed his face, but anger quickly replaced it. You all want an explanation? He said. Fine. Maybe I wanted him embarrassed. Maybe I wanted everyone to stop treating him like some perfect father who never made a selfish decision in his life. I felt the old business dispute return to my mind. Years earlier, Richard had asked me to invest in a development project. I refused after reviewing the numbers. He had told me I humiliated him in front of potential investors. I thought the resentment had faded. Clearly, it hadn't. This is about the development deal, I said. Richard's expression told me I was right before he said a word. Emily looked between us. What development deal? Richard laughed without humor. Ask your grandfather. Ask him what happened when I finally had a chance to build something of my own. I understood then that we had reached the real story beneath the $500. The money had only opened the door. What Richard had carried into that restaurant was something far older and far more dangerous, a grievance he had been feeding for years. The development deal? Emily asked. Richard gave a bitter laugh. Of course he never told you. I looked around the table and realized most of my family knew only fragments of what had happened 7 years earlier. Richard had been 38 then, ambitious and convinced he was finally ready to build something entirely his own. He and 2 partners planned to purchase an aging commercial property outside Atlanta, renovate it, divide it into premium office space, and sell before the market shifted. On paper, the opportunity looked impressive. Richard came to me asking for $400,000, and, more importantly, my name beside his. He believed my reputation would persuade several hesitant investors to join. I wanted to support him, so I spent an entire weekend reviewing the proposal. By Sunday night, I knew I couldn't invest. The projected renovation costs were unrealistically low. The partnership was already carrying significant debt, and their profit estimates depended on selling at prices the surrounding market had never supported. I didn't tell Richard he was incapable. I told him the numbers were dangerous. You didn't just say no, Richard snapped across the restaurant. You questioned the project in front of everyone. I remembered the meeting he meant. 2 potential investors had asked for my assessment because Richard had repeatedly told them I supported the deal. I refused to lie. I explained that I couldn't recommend investing until the debt structure and cost assumptions were corrected. Both investors withdrew within days. The project collapsed shortly afterward. Richard had blamed me ever since. You embarrassed me, he said now. You sat there with 30 years of experience and made me look like a child who couldn't read his own numbers. I answered questions honestly. You could have backed me. Backing, you would have meant pretending the risks weren't real. His face hardened. You always have an answer. I shook my head. No, Richard. I had spreadsheets. You brought me a project asking for $400,000. I evaluated it the same way I would evaluate any investment. That seemed to anger him more. Exactly. I wasn't any investment. I was your son. And because you were my son, I wasn't going to help you bury yourself under debt. The room became silent. Richard looked around at the faces watching him and finally began saying things he had apparently carried for years. After those investors withdrew, one of his partners blamed him publicly. Another left the venture. Richard had already spent nearly $60,000 on planning, consultants, deposits, and legal work. He borrowed money to cover part of the loss and spent years recovering. Each time my own retirement accounts grew, each time relatives praised my career, he compared my stability with what he saw as the failure I had caused him. You walked away untouched, he said. I spent years paying for your decision. No, I replied. You spent years paying for yours. He stared at me. I continued before he could interrupt. I didn't choose that property. I didn't create those projections. I didn't sign your partnership agreement. And I didn't force you to spend money before financing was secured. Richard slammed his palm against the table. Emily flinched. That reaction stopped me colder than the sound itself. Richard saw it too. For a second he looked at his daughter, then quickly turned back to me. There, he said. That's what you do. You make everything sound reasonable until everyone believes you're the only intelligent person in the room. Suddenly I understood something I had missed for 7 years. Richard had never wanted me to admit the investment was good. He wanted me to accept responsibility for everything that happened afterward. Without that admission, he had been forced to face the possibility that his own judgment had failed him. Blaming me had been easier. So tonight was repayment? I asked. Richard didn't answer. You wanted me humiliated because you believe I humiliated you 7 years ago? His eyes shifted away. Sarah whispered his name in disbelief. David simply shook his head. Emily looked devastated. Dad, you planned all of this because Grandpa wouldn't give you money? It wasn't about the money, Richard shouted. Then what was it about? She demanded. His face flushed. Respect. That single word explained more than everything he had said before it. He looked directly at me. Everyone respects you. Dad knows best. Dad built the successful company. Dad made the smart investments. Dad saved the family whenever somebody screwed up. Do you know what it's like spending your whole life being compared to that? I let the question sit between us before answering. No one at this table asked you to become me. Richard's expression twisted. They didn't have to. He looked around the room, then back at me, and whatever restraint remained finally disappeared. I wanted them to look at you differently for once. The words hung in the air. Emily stared at her father. Differently how? Richard hesitated. That hesitation told me the answer would be worse than anything we had heard so far. I stepped closer. Say it, Richard. You locked the doors. You wanted everyone here. You wanted an audience. Tell them what you wanted them to see when they looked at me tonight. For several seconds my son said nothing. Then his eyes settled on the $500 still clenched in his hand, and I realized we were finally about to hear what this entire night had truly been designed to accomplish. Richard stared at the $500 in his hand for so long that I wondered whether he would answer at all. Then he placed the bills on the table and said quietly, I wanted them to stop seeing you as the good man. No one moved. Emily looked at her father as if she were hearing the voice of a stranger. "What does that mean?" she asked. Richard laughed bitterly. "It means exactly what I said. For my entire life, whenever something went wrong, Dad was the reasonable one. Dad was the successful one. Dad was the man everyone trusted. I made one bad investment, and suddenly I became the son who needed saving." I shook my head. "I never called you a failure. You didn't have to." His voice rose. "Every time someone asked your opinion before mine, every time Sarah called you for advice, every time David talked about how you built your life from nothing, I heard it." Sarah stared at him. "That was never a competition. Maybe not to you." Richard turned back toward me. "I wanted one night where people looked at him and wondered if maybe they had been wrong all these years." There it was. The truth we had spent the entire evening circling. The missing money had never mattered. Richard wanted suspicion. He wanted 23 people to watch $500 emerge from my jacket and carry that image home with them. Even if I eventually proved my innocence, the question would remain. Had Thomas Bennett really stolen from his own son? So that was the plan? David asked. Accuse Dad of theft in front of his granddaughter? Richard immediately defended himself. "I wasn't going to destroy him." "You threatened to call the police," Sarah said. "I wanted him scared." "You locked the doors," Mark added. "Because everyone would have left," Richard shouted. The moment the words escaped, he realized what he had admitted. Nobody responded. He had just confirmed that the audience mattered as much as the accusation. I stepped toward him. "What was supposed to happen tonight, Richard?" He looked away. "You already know. I want to hear you say it." His jaw tightened. "Why? So you can give another speech?" "No. Because your daughter deserves to know why her graduation became your revenge." That landed. Richard glanced at Emily, but she didn't rescue him. Finally, he spoke. "I wanted people to see you accused of something you couldn't explain. I wanted you standing there while everyone questioned you. Just once. And then? I don't know." "Yes, you do." His voice dropped. "Maybe I would have let it go after a few minutes." Sarah gave a disbelieving laugh. "After threatening Dad with the police?" Richard snapped that everything had gone wrong because Emily interfered. Emily recoiled. "Don't blame me for what you planned. You stole the money, and I admitted it." Her voice shook, but she held his gaze. "Can you admit what you did?" Richard said nothing. That silence finally stripped away every excuse he had left. I looked at my son and felt something unexpected. Not triumph, grief. I remembered teaching him to ride a bicycle, sitting beside him through school projects, helping him buy his first car. Somewhere along the way, the boy who once wanted my approval had become a man who believed destroying my reputation would somehow repair his own. "Richard," I said, "you think I stole your respect 7 years ago. I didn't. You handed it away tonight." His eyes hardened. "There you go again?" "No. Look around." I pointed toward the table. "Nobody here is angry because your business failed. Nobody cares that I refused your investment. They're looking at you this way because you turned your daughter's graduation into a stage for revenge." Richard glanced around the room. Sarah wouldn't meet his eyes. David looked disgusted. Mark stood beside the doors with his arms folded. Laura was crying silently. Then Richard looked at Emily. She had moved several feet away from him and was holding Sarah's hand. That image seemed to hit him harder than anything I had said. "Emily," he whispered. She didn't answer. He took one step toward her. She stepped backward. I moved between them. "Stop." Richard stared at me. "Get out of my way." "No. She's my daughter." "Then look at her." He did. "Your daughter is afraid to stand near you." Richard's face tightened. "You turned her against me." "I didn't know any of this until tonight." He had no answer. I looked toward the locked restaurant doors and suddenly understood what needed to happen next. Richard had begun the evening by trapping everyone inside, because he wanted control over who witnessed my humiliation. I walked past him, reached the doors, and placed my hand on the lock. "You wanted everyone trapped here until they saw the truth," I said. Then I turned the lock and pulled the doors open. "They've seen it." Richard stared at the open doorway, but I wasn't finished. There was still one thing I needed my son to understand before this night ended, and it had nothing to do with $500. The click of the lock sounded strangely loud in the silent room. I pulled both restaurant doors open and stepped aside. Nobody is trapped here anymore. Richard stared at me, then at the hallway beyond the doorway. Less than an hour earlier, he had locked those doors because he wanted complete control over what happened inside. Now they stood open, and not one person rushed to leave. They remained because the truth had finally become more important than the celebration Richard had destroyed. "You wanted an audience," I said. "You have one." "But they didn't see what you wanted them to see." Richard's face tightened. "You think you won? This isn't a victory." I pointed toward Emily. "Look at your daughter." He glanced at her. She stood beside Laura and Sarah, keeping several feet between herself and her father. "She was so frightened of what you might do tonight that she made a terrible decision trying to stop you. She stole your money. She put it in my pocket. She knows that was wrong, and she admitted it in front of everyone." I paused. "Now ask yourself why your own daughter believed she had to protect her grandfather from you." Richard looked away. "You've poisoned her against me. I knew nothing about her plan until tonight. She worships you. Everyone does. Stop blaming other people for choices you made." His eyes flashed with anger, but I refused to raise my voice. 7 years ago, I refused to invest in a bad deal. You turned that into humiliation. Tonight, you tried to repay an insult that existed mostly in your own mind by destroying my reputation in front of my family. And when it failed, you blamed Emily. Richard stepped toward me. "You cost me everything." "No, I refused to finance something I believed would fail. Everything after that was yours to decide." For several seconds we stood facing each other. I could see him searching for the version of me he had expected tonight, angry, defensive, humiliated. I wouldn't give it to him. "Do you know what the worst part is?" I asked. "It isn't the search. It isn't the accusation. It isn't even hearing my own son call me a thief. The worst part is realizing you carried this resentment for 7 years while sitting at my table, celebrating birthdays, spending holidays with us, and allowing your daughter to grow up inside anger you refused to confront." Richard glanced toward Emily again. This time she didn't lower her eyes. "I'm sorry I took the money," she said quietly. "I'm not sorry I told the truth." Laura began crying harder. Richard turned toward her. "Are you going to stand there and let them do this?" Laura wiped her face. "They aren't doing this to you, Richard." He stared at her. "You did it to yourself." That sentence seemed to take the last of the fight out of him. He looked around the room, perhaps expecting someone to defend him. Nobody did. Not because I had ordered them to choose sides, but because they had watched every choice he made that night. I walked back to the table, picked up the $500, and placed them beside Richard's phone. "Take your money." He didn't move. "Dad, no." It was the first time that night I stopped him before he could finish. "I spent most of your life trying to help you when things went wrong. Sometimes I gave advice. Sometimes I gave money. Sometimes I stood between you and consequences, because I thought that was what fathers were supposed to do." I took a breath. "Tonight I finally understand that protecting you from consequences hasn't always helped you, so I'm not doing it anymore." His face changed. For the first time, the anger gave way to uncertainty. "What does that mean?" "It means you leave." Laura looked at me, then at Richard. Emily remained beside her mother. "You can come back when you're ready to take responsibility without blaming me, Emily, your mother, your wife, or a business deal from 7 years ago. Until then, you are not welcome in my home." Richard stared at me for several seconds, picked up his phone, and walked toward the open doors. He stopped beside Emily. "Are you coming?" She shook her head. "No." That one word seemed to wound him more deeply than anything I had said. He looked toward Laura. She didn't move either. Richard finally walked out alone. Nobody followed him. I watched my son disappear down the hallway and felt no satisfaction, only the heavy sadness of knowing that sometimes loving someone means refusing to rescue them from the consequences they created. Behind me, Emily began crying. I turned and opened my arms. She crossed the room and held me tightly. "I'm sorry, Grandpa. I know. Did I ruin everything?" I looked toward the open doors Richard had locked less than an hour earlier. "No, sweetheart," I whispered. "The truth didn't ruin this family. It only showed us what had already been breaking. and none of us yet understood how much Richard would lose once he walked through those doors. Richard did not come back that night. In the weeks that followed, I learned that walking through those restaurant doors had been only the beginning of the consequences he had spent years creating. Laura took Emily and moved into her sister's house. She told Richard she needed time away from a marriage in which everyone had learned to measure their words against his anger. Sarah stopped answering his calls after he accused her of choosing me over him. David agreed to speak with him once, but when Richard spent most of the conversation blaming me for destroying the family, David ended it with one sentence. Dad didn't destroy anything. He just stopped hiding what you were doing. Emily's decision hurt Richard most of all. She refused to see him until he agreed to counseling and accepted responsibility for what happened without blaming anyone else. For months, he couldn't do it. He sent apologies followed by explanations, then explanations followed by accusations. Every message proved he still wanted forgiveness without accountability. I never answered them. Not because I hated my son, but because I finally understood that rescuing him again would only teach him that consequences were temporary obstacles someone else would eventually remove. His business began struggling within the year. The resentment and impulsiveness we had seen inside the family had followed him into professional relationships as well. 2 important partners left, several clients moved elsewhere, and eventually Richard sold what remained of the company. I didn't celebrate. I didn't say he deserved it. When Sarah asked whether I planned to help him financially, I told her no. Richard had spent years believing I controlled whether he succeeded or failed. The only way to break that belief was to stop participating in the outcome. Time moved forward. Laura eventually filed for divorce. Richard relocated and slowly disappeared from our daily lives. Emily, however, did something very different with the worst night of hers. She learned from it. She never excused stealing the $500 or placing it in my pocket. Whenever we spoke about that evening, she admitted that fear had pushed her into a reckless decision. But she also learned that courage meant correcting a mistake before silence allowed someone innocent to suffer for it. Years later, I sat in an auditorium beside Sarah and David, watching Emily walk across a stage in a white coat. She had become a doctor. When her name was announced, I stood and applauded until my hands hurt. After the ceremony, she found me in the crowd and wrapped her arms around me. "You know what I remember most about graduation night?" she asked. I expected her to mention the money or the locked doors. Instead, she said, "You never shouted. Even when everyone thought you were guilty, you waited for the truth." I smiled. "And you told it when it mattered." That evening taught me something I wish I had understood much earlier. A parent's job isn't to prevent a child from ever failing. Sometimes love means refusing to carry consequences that belong to them. Richard believed I had destroyed his future by refusing one bad investment. Years later, I understood the truth. I could advise him, forgive him, even love him, but I could never take responsibility for the man he chose to become. And when I think about what I will eventually leave behind, I don't think about money, property, or anything written into an estate document. I think about Emily standing in that restaurant, terrified but determined to tell the truth. That is the legacy I care about. The courage to admit when you're wrong, the strength to speak when silence would be easier, and the wisdom to understand that protecting a family sometimes means allowing the truth to hurt before it can finally begin to heal.